Okay, great. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining today. And I'm here to talk to you about optical remote sensing of snow. And I'll talk more about what that actually means in a second here. But in case you don't know me and I can't see many of your names right now, so maybe I don't know you. I just wanted to introduce myself real quick. I'm an assistant professor in the geography department at the University of Utah. And I'm broadly a snow hydrologist, but within snow hydrology, I really focus on field and remote sensing measurements of snow energy balance and snow volume, and how we can use that information to update models to improve the way that we forecast how much water is held as snow in the mountains. I sort of started my journey into snow science growing up in Alaska. You guys have ever been there, maybe you recognize I'm standing in this picture in front of Portage Glacier, and spent a lot of time in the snow. And as soon as I figured out you could do snow science as a job, there was really no turning back. So I've been fortunate enough to do field work in many mountain ranges all over the world, and many other places like Greenland. But my research really focuses on mid-latitude mountain snow cover. I did my undergraduate at the University of Utah, my PhD at UCLA, and then I did a postdoc at NASA JPL. And all of those have sort of focused on optical remote sensing techniques, which is what I'll be talking to you about today. So just to give you an overview of the webinar, we'll be talking about sort of just really broadly optical remote sensing 101. If you've taken a remote sensing class, feel free to sort of tune out during those slides, but I just want to make sure everyone has the same background as we go into this webinar. We'll talk a little bit more about snow reflectance, and we'll do some practice with an online radiative transfer model. We'll get into some useful definitions to understand when talking about snow remote sensing. And then we'll go into specific sort of techniques or applications. So starting with multispectral satellites, then imaging spectroscopy or hyperspectral remote sensing, and then photogrammetry and structure for motion and LiDAR. These are some just sneak peek figures here. Okay, so what do I mean when I am saying optical or solar wavelengths? This is the part of the spectrum basically where sunlight is coming in to the surface of the Earth. So part of that spectrum are the visible wavelengths where we see, but it also extends past the visible wavelengths out to about 2,500 nanometers. So that's the near infrared and shortwave infrared. The reason why this wavelength range is really useful for remote sensing is that it exists in a range that has what we call atmospheric windows. So essentially sunlight can both enter through the atmosphere, reach the surface of the Earth, and then be reflected back out to satellites. Whereas in other wavelength ranges, the energy is either attenuated in the atmosphere coming in or going back out. So another atmospheric window is in the microwave wavelengths. And that's the type of remote sensing that we'll be talking about during the next webinar. So just to sort of refresh on what the solar spectrum actually looks like, this is the distribution of sunlight across wavelengths coming in both at the top of the atmosphere, that's that upper curve, and then at the surface of the Earth, that's this lower curve. And what this plot shows us is that the most energy from the sun is coming in the visible wavelengths, which is very convenient for us because that's where we see. But then there's this sort of large portion of the solar or optical spectrum that is past the visible wavelengths, sort of drops off in intensity or spectral radiance as we head out into the shortwave infrared wavelengths. And we can see that at the surface, not all of the energy that's coming in at the top of the atmosphere makes it to the surface, and that's because some of it is being absorbed in the atmosphere by things like water or oxygen. And those have distinct absorption bands that limit the amount of energy that come in those wavelengths. So when we talk about optical remote sensing, there's two different types. Well, any type of remote sensing, I guess, is true. There's passive, and in terms of optical remote sensing, the passive just means that the instrument we're using is measuring reflected sunlight. So it's a passive detector. The most common example of this is a camera. It's measuring reflected light off of the surface, but it also includes multispectral satellites and radiometers that sort of integrate across the full solar wavelengths. And then there's active instruments that don't rely on sunlight at all. They emit their own energy and then reflect or measure how much of that is reflected back at the sensor. So in the optical wavelengths, the best example of this is LiDAR, which uses a single laser at a single wavelength typically and measures that wavelength reflection back. Or in this instance, it's the cat laser. What makes also optical remote sensing really useful is that all land surface types have sort of a unique spectral signature. So they interact with light differently. And that means that in some wavelength ranges, they absorb more, and in some, they reflect more. And the characteristics of absorption and reflection across this whole optical wavelength is known as the spectral signature or the spectral reflectance of different surface types. So if we look at this picture and we have sort of soil, rock, water, vegetation, and snow, we can look at that with a remote sensing instrument and separate out those land surface types based upon their reflectance characteristics. So snow is very bright in the visible wavelengths and gets darker into the infrared. Vegetation is pretty dark in the visible wavelengths, but then gets much brighter into the infrared. Soil is pretty dark across the board, and then also water is very absorptive. So these unique characteristics allow us to map these different land surface types and then also track how they change over time. So we're going to focus really closely today on snow reflectance and sort of what makes up this snow reflectance curve or the spectral signature of snow. So everyone who's ever looked at snow knows this. Snow is really reflective in the visible wavelengths. It's actually one of the brightest natural surfaces on Earth, reflecting up to 99% of incoming sunlight. And that's because in the visible wavelengths, ice itself is transparent. And snow is made up of many small grains. So there's a lot of scattering opportunities between the snow grains. And this means that there's a lot of reflection opportunities. So light sort of enters into the snowpack and just gets scattered back out. So reflectance, the scale or magnitude of reflectance in this range is actually controlled by anything that darkens the snow surface. And typically those are dark aerosols like dust or black carbon or brown carbon, or even can be sort of natural dark constituents like algae or pine needles or char. And then as we move out past the visible wavelengths into the near infrared wavelengths, ice is increasingly absorptive. It's no longer transparent. And that means in the longer wavelengths that the more ice you have in your snowpack, the more absorption you'll have. So as grains grow over time with metamorphic processes, you get more absorption. And we use a couple different terms to describe this. One of them is the effective grain radius, which describes snow as spheres of a certain size, or the specific surface area, which describes how much of the area is taken up by ice. But essentially, both of those are describing how much ice the light is passing through. So if we were just to sort of break this apart into regions about what controls snow reflectance, We know that in the visible wavelengths, it's snow darkening or absorption by what we call light absorbing particles. And then out into the near infrared and shortwave infrared, it's ice absorption. Okay, so this is the first sort of activity I have for you guys. If you could open up a browser window and go to this website, Snow Engineering Department at University of Michigan. But we're gonna visit this online version of the snow, ice, and aerosol radiative transfer model. And let me see if I can just do this with you guys. I'm also gonna share my screen here. Okay, so you should be able to see my web browser open with SNICAR, and you can leave everything the same except for number 6, the snow effective grain radius. And the first one I want you to try is just 100 microns. And that's the only box that you need to change. You can leave everything else the same. And then you can hit simulate up at the top or at the bottom. And what you'll see pop up is the spectral reflectance of snow with the following characteristics that are listed below. So kind of visually see where the reflectance is out here in the near infrared. What we call the ice absorption feature, this sort of little dip right here, is around 0.8. If I'm to go back and increase this value, just this value, to 500, and then hit simulate again, I can see that that grain size absorption feature, sort of the value of it, has now dropped to 0.6, just due to the increase in grain size. So I'm going to go back again one more time and then change that to 1,000. Hit simulate again. And again, the whole spectrum has dropped. So this shows us, let me minimize this. If I were to collect all of those and put them on a plot together, what I see is that as I get increasing grain size, I get decreasing reflectance in the near infrared. And that is controlled inherently by grain size, or what we call the path length that light is traveling through ice. So the next one I want you to do is to leave the snow grain effective radius set at 500, and then just change the black carbon concentration, which is number 9 in the radiative transfer model. Let me bring it back, my browser window back up here. Maybe. Sorry, I lost my browser window, but hopefully you guys are all there. So I suggest changing it. You can change it in sort of increments of 100 like I did, or you could just jump right up to, you know, like 1,000 parts per billion, which is a lot of black carbon. And if you're not sure exactly what I mean by black carbon, that's just the scientific name for soot. Very dark aerosol. And so if you simulate that a couple of times, what you'll see is as you increase the black carbon concentration while leaving the grain size set at one value, that you primarily get a decrease in visible reflectance or visible albedo. with an increase in black carbon concentrations. So this is just to demonstrate that the controls on snow reflectance are fairly well known and that we can simulate them. Sorry, I jumped ahead. And we can leverage these controls on snow reflectance to actually retrieve properties about the snow from measured reflectance. So I encourage you, if you're interested in snow reflectance or modeling snow albedo or understanding the impact of snow darkening or snow grain growth over time, to play around with this online model. There's a lot of options that I didn't have you enter today. You can input dust into the model, different types of dust into the model. You can do volcanic ash. You can do snow algae. You can change the way that snow grains are represented, whether they're just as spheres or more complex shapes. You can change the solar zenith angle. You can, there's a lot of flexibility here. And then there's documentation up at the top of the model if you're interested in learning more about what goes into the model, or if you're interested in downloading the source code from MATLAB, it's linked to get it from GitHub. So this is a really valuable tool in simulating snow reflectance and in remote sensing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some definitions. And I've already kind of gone back between calling spectral reflectance, and albedo. So I just wanted to clarify what the difference is between reflectance and albedo. Reflectance is the measurement type that we get from remote sensing instruments. So essentially, I'll walk through this. We get sunlight in at a certain angle, but then that light interacts with the surface and is reflected back across many angles. And that's what we call the hemisphere. When we have a detector, a remote sensing instrument, we're only seeing a portion of that reflected sunlight, not all of it, because we're looking from a certain angle. This is known as directional reflectance, or the hemispherical directional reflectance factor, which just describes how light is over the whole hemisphere, but our detector is from a certain direction. Albedo is bihemispherical reflectance, where we're measuring all of the light that is being reflected back over a hemisphere as well. So there's no directional component to the measurement. So just to give you an idea, remote sensing is always looking from a certain direction. We can measure albedo, but it takes a certain type of instrument. Maybe some of you guys have seen this out at field sites. This is a radiometer, where it's a dome looking up and looking down, measuring light coming in all directions. So there's no directional component to that. And the reason why I'm sort of stressing this is because it's very important for snow, because snow does not reflect light evenly in all directions. It actually is forward scattering. So if we're looking at light from a certain direction, that doesn't mean that we could move our detector to another angle and measure the exact same amount of light. And that is what is being described in these plots, is sort of the changing distribution in light depending on how you're looking at the snow or what direction you're looking at the snow from. So as a sort of take-home point for this is that light's not reflected from snow evenly in all directions, and sort of the variation in that forward scattering varies with wavelength. So in order to interpret remote sensing measurements of snow reflectance, we have to know both the illumination angle, so where the sun is at, and the viewing angle, where the detector is at, in order to interpret the reflectance signature and to accurately retrieve snow properties from snow reflectance. Okay, so a few more definitions here. These ones are fairly well known, but I just wanted to cover all the bases here. Spatial resolution is the linear spacing between measurements. So if it's a grid, then this means the pixel size. And this is the smallest object that you could detect within your scene would need to be larger than your pixel size. So just as an example of this, MODIS is at 500 meters in the land bands. And I'm showing an example over here of the resolution of MODIS at 500 meters versus Landsat at 30 meters for the same retrieval, which is snow albedo. And then temporal resolution is how frequently the same area is imaged. So an example for this is Landsat passes over the same spot on Earth every 16 days. That's the revisit time and the temporal resolution. Spectral resolution is how many wavelength intervals of the solar spectrum are measured. So, something that we're all familiar with, cameras, the spectral resolution of camera images are 3 bands, all in the visible wavelengths, red, green, and blue. And then another important type of resolution is radiometric. And this is the variation in brightness recorded in each pixel. Essentially, how many shades of gray do you get between black and white? The reason why this matters for snow is that if you don't have high radiometric resolution, often snow can be saturated by the detector, meaning that it's just too bright to actually detect variations in brightness at the snow surface. So resolutions are important when talking about optical remote sensing because often there's trade-offs between spatial and temporal resolution or temporal and spectral resolution. Essentially, there's no perfect satellite that measures snow at high resolution every day across all of the wavelengths. We get to see snow almost every day from MODIS, but it's relatively coarse spatial resolution and relatively coarse spectral resolution. So there's these trade-offs that impact the way that we can use that data to analyze snow properties or snow trends over time. So just to visualize this and talk a little bit more about spectral resolution, I have a plot up here, showing the same plots we would have made from SNICAR, so change in grain size as grains get larger, or change in reflectance as black carbon concentrations get higher. And then I've overlaid on top of those the MODIS bands that we can use to look at snow. And immediately what sort of pops out here is that this sort of first grain size absorption feature is not measured by MODIS. There's bands on sort of either side of it, but we don't get to see the full spectrum from MODIS, which is a multispectral satellite. So what that means is that there are multiple discrete but non-continuous bands across the solar wavelengths. If we have an imaging spectrometer, that means that there are many narrow and continuous bands across the full spectrum. So an imaging spectrometer would return data that looks something more like these full spectral signatures because the bands that are being measured are continuous with each other. There's no gaps in that measurement. And then RGB imagery, like I mentioned before, is 3 bands across the visible wavelengths, red, green, and blue. There are now cameras too that add in 1 near infrared band into that, so that would be a 4-band camera. And then there's panchromatic imagery. That's just a single very wide band covering the visible wavelengths. And then there's LiDAR, which would just cover basically what we call monochromatic, so 1 wavelength. So it's a laser at 1 wavelength. And I encourage everyone to go and visit this link. It's a Landsat tool that allows you to visualize bands for different land cover types. And I'm just gonna pop one up here. Sorry, the colors are not fantastic, but what I'm showing here is a snow spectra curve. That's the pink curve behind, overlaid with MODIS bands. And so that shows you the actual width or the wavelength ranges that are being measured by MODIS, what's being captured and what's being missed. when we look at snow from multispectral satellites. And if you go to this website that I'm linking to here, you can choose MODIS or different versions of the Landsat satellites or Sentinel, and you can see how their what we call band passes change between instruments and what part of the snow spectrum is measured. At this tool, you can also change the underlying spectra that you're looking at. So you can see how a vegetation spectrum or a water spectrum is sampled by these satellites. It's very useful when we're thinking about retrieving properties from multispectral satellites to know what part of this spectrum is measured and what's missed. So just to visualize this a little bit more, this is red, green, and blue bands, so the visible wavelengths. If we were to take just those bands out, we could create what we call a true color image or true color composite. And then just to visualize sort of this single wavelength LiDAR, it falls within the optical wavelengths, right? But it doesn't depend on sunlight. It just uses one wavelength. For snow, one of the most common wavelengths to use is 1064 nanometers. That's in the near infrared. And in the near infrared, snow is still reflective, but light doesn't penetrate very deeply into the snow, maybe a centimeter. And so that's really the ideal wavelength to use to detect snow. Other common wavelengths for LiDAR are around 1550 because it's eye safe. You don't have to worry about sort of shooting out anyone's, retina. And then 550 is another common one, and that one is used often for water, so mapping bathymetry. Okay, so that was spectral resolution, and now we can chat a little bit more about platforms and spatial resolution. So remote sensing, satellite remote sensing is an awesome way to monitor snow because it allows us to see areas that we can't travel to ourselves, and it allows us to see those at really regular intervals. But, like I said before, there's trade-offs between spectral, spatial, and temporal resolution. So MODIS is daily temporal resolution, but relatively coarse 500-meter spatial resolution. So that's really ideal for regional scale monitoring of snow. Landsat allows us to view things in more detail, but is only every 2 weeks. And so if it happens to be cloudy when Landsat passes over, sometimes it could be every month. So a lot can happen in a month in the mountains. Snow can accumulate, it can melt out. So Landsat isn't as useful for seasonal scale monitoring of snow, but it is really useful for long-term interannual scale monitoring of snow. So satellites are awesome, but they don't give us always exactly what we're looking for. And to fill the gap between satellite retrievals, we also use airborne measurements and drones to measure snow. And airborne measurements have been around for a long time. The popularity of drones for monitoring snow cover is a little more recent, but really increasing in popularity. And the benefit of, habited and uninhabited aircraft is that you can go where you want, when you want to. So if something interesting is happening in the mountains, your plane can take off and go measure it. You're not limited by the orbit of the satellite or, waiting for Landsat to pass over in 16 days. And you can cover a decent amount of ground with airplanes. You can cover large basins in a single flight. And then UAVs or drones are, smaller spatial scale, but also very flexible and pretty affordable technology. Flying a plane can get expensive, but buying a drone is a more accessible technology for mapping snow cover. Okay, so let's chat a little bit about what we can actually get from optical remote sensing. So from spectrometers, whether those are multispectral or hyperspectral, What those give us is surface information, because sunlight doesn't penetrate very deeply into the snowpack, right? It's really retrieving information about the snow surface. So we can get snow covered area and extent, and then from multiple retrievals, we can get snow duration, so we can see how that snow extent is changing, increasing and decreasing over time. We can map snow grain size, leveraging this sort of unique reflectance characteristics of snow. We can get snow darkening by light absorbing particles. And we can model snow albedo from measured snow reflectance measurements. And then if we have camera images or RGB imagery, we can get what we call viewable snow extent. So that's essentially the snow extent that you can see with your eyes. And then you can also take multiple overlapping images and use photogrammetry to map surface elevations. And then you can combine two retrievals, snow free and snow on, to map snow depth. So the way that we actually get volume information from optical remote sensing requires two retrievals, at least, one without snow and one with snow. And the same concept applies to LiDAR. It's a differential mapping technique. So it's primarily used to map snow depth using range measurements at two different times. So snow free and snow on. And what I'm showing over on the right here are just two examples of snow extent. This is a true color image from Worldview, and then snow extent mapped from Worldview. And for the same scene, snow extent mapped from MODIS. So another really great example of changing spatial resolutions. And then down below is a surface model and surface elevation from photogrammetry from images collected from a plane. Okay, so how do we take a multispectral satellite data and actually get something useful from it? The normalized difference snow index has been, oh, did I skip? Yeah, okay, so the normalized difference snow index has been used for a very long time. It was developed in the 80s to retrieve snow-covered area from multispectral satellite information. And essentially it uses two bands. So an example here is from MODIS, where I'm showing the bands in white that are visible, essentially that are detected by MODIS. And it leverages one band where snow is very reflective, so a band in the visible wavelengths, and another band where snow is not reflective, so where it's very absorptive, and it combines those into a band ratio that returns a value where essentially everything, it can vary by sensor a little bit, but everything above 0.4, for example, for MODIS, would be indicated as snow cover. So I just saw a question in the chat too. Viz is a visible band. They were asking what Viz and SWIR stands for. Shortwave infrared is SWIR. So a visible band minus a shortwave infrared band divided by a visible band plus a shortwave infrared band. So an example for Landsat, this would be, for Landsat 8, this would be band 3 and band 6. Or for MODIS, this would be band 4 and band 6. And this is a very computationally simple way to map snow cover. You can apply it to a lot of imagery and get out snow cover very quickly, very cheap computational cost. And one of the problems with this is that for a long time, it was primarily binary. So the pixel would get classified as either snow or not snow. And one of the problems with that you could kind of think through is that at 500 meters with MODIS, for example, in the mountains, it's almost certainly not purely snow covered. So it's usually what we call a mixed pixel, which means that it's snow and vegetation or snow and rock or snow, rock, and vegetation. And so a method was developed called spectral unmixing, not just for snow, but for lots of different land cover types, that basically takes reflectance in a pixel and it runs it through a lookup table made up of pure reflectances. So it would be a reflectance for vegetation or a reflectance for rock. And it mixes those in different combinations until it matches the reflectance in that pixel. And what that allows spectral unmixing to do is essentially identify the fractional cover of each land type in each pixel. And so this returns fractional coverage of snow, which is the acronym for that is FSCA, or fractional snow covered area, in addition to the fractional coverage of other land surface types. So you could get fractional vegetation. In addition to land cover types, you can also get the fractional coverage of clouds, because clouds reflect light differently than snow. And so this allows you to map from MODIS, especially the fractional cover of snow, which is very useful in terrain where pixels are almost always mixed. So that's the two sort of primary ways that snow-covered area is mapped from multispectral sensors. Another variable of interest to get from these multispectral sensors is snow grain size. So there's a band index for that as well. It's called the normalized difference grain size index. And that takes one band in the near infrared and one band in the shortwave infrared, and applies it to the same band ratio. And an example for MODIS is band 2 and band 5, which I'm pointing out with red arrows here. And you can see that the reflectance is quite different in band 2 and band 5. And this also returns just a ratio. And then that ratio is related back to optical grain radius. It's a nonlinear relationship that I'm showing down in this lower plot. So the normalized difference grain size index, or NDGSI, is related to optical grain radius across this curve that varies a little bit depending on your solar zenith angle. So depending on the time of day of your satellite, or your overpass of your satellite, would determine which relationship you would use to relate your NDGSI to your optical grain radius. So this is an example of NDGSI mapped from Landsat 8 over the Sierra Nevada, where lighter colors are larger grains and darker colors are smaller grains. There's also a retrieval for grain size from spectral unmixing that I had already mentioned before. So what happens with spectral unmixing is that for each pixel, there's fractional snow cover retrieved. And that means that it's detected that that pixel is at least partially covered in snow. And the next step of the algorithm then would be to return an effective grain radius for each one of those snow end members. And what this means is that it's basically matching to a snow reflectance curve of a certain grain size. So if you look at this plot, what I'm showing is clean snow and coarse grained snow, and they're different reflectance curves. So through the spectral unmixing process, the snow spectra is going to be matched to a certain grain size. And so for each fraction of snow, it's also returning a grain size for the fraction of snow within that pixel. Okay, so let me just back up here real quick, because I saw another question. a snow end member within the spectral end mixing process. The question is, what's a snow end member? The snow end member just essentially is what has been matched. So you're using a measured reflectance to match it through this sort of library or lookup table of pure reflectances. And when you match it to like snow or vegetation, that's the end member. So in this plot, I'm showing a mixture of snow and vegetation. So that means that reflectance matched two end members. It's a mixture of snow and vegetation. So this snow part of this pixel would also have a grain size in this algorithm. Okay, so then darkening by LAPs can also be retrieved from multispectral satellites. It's a multi-step process. So first, we would retrieve the normalized difference grain size index, or the NDGSI, to map the grain size over an area. And then we would use that grain size to model a theoretical clean snow spectra. So for the same grain size. In this plot, I'm showing it for this dotted line or this dashed line. You can see that they line up here in the near infrared and shortwave infrared. So that's a modeled spectra. And then we can calculate the difference between the observed spectra represented here in red and the modeled spectra, clean snow spectra, represented by the dashed line. And that allows us to map something called delta albedo. So basically, how much was the albedo changed by the presence of light absorbing particles? How much was it reduced? And then we can basically take incoming sunlight at the time of the satellite overpass and times it by the change in visible albedo. And that returns something called radiative forcing, which is the enhanced absorption of solar radiation due to surface darkening. And that allows us to quantify in watts per meter squared the impact of surface darkening, which I'm showing here just as an example for the Sierra Nevada at different time steps. And then here is an example from MODIS, so coarser scale and a broader regional scale. But in the Rocky Mountains, where this region that I'm showing, our upper Colorado River Basin, it gets quite dusty in the spring. So I just wanted to show a picture of this so we can get radiative forcing values that are quite dramatic. And using this algorithm allows us to track basically darkening or dust deposition over time in different mountain ranges around the world. Okay, so that's multispectral data, and I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna go through these next slides kind of quickly, but I'm always happy to answer questions. So if we have multispectral data, basically data or information about snow reflectance at all wavelengths across the optical spectrum, we can leverage this information to do quantitative retrievals. We don't have to rely on band ratios or libraries of end member reflectances. We can actually leverage, for example, the depth of this ice absorption feature and relate it to grain size. Then we can take that grain size and run through a similar process that I just talked about, where we can model a clean snow reflectance, compare it to the measured snow spectra to get change in visible albedo and radiative forcing. So I'm showing an example here for retrievals for mountains in Colorado, where this is the true color image. You can see that it's pretty dusty over the snow. And then here's the algorithm retrieval for grain size using this scaled band area method. If you're interested in reading more about that, the citation is here. And then we can model albedo and radiative forcing. And the methods for this are described in more detail in these papers. So I just want to point out that, imaging spectroscopy always looks really good. It's at really high spatial resolution. It's really high spectral resolution. The uncertainties are very low, but there's no satellite that measures this sort of spectral reflectance at really high spectral resolution yet. There are 2 that are planned for launch, but right now we're sort of limited to planes and ground-based measurements to take these spectral reflectance measurements. And these tend to be not in time series. So they're sort of one-off flights every now and then. They don't capture all a range of conditions, which has allowed for algorithm development, but it's really limited process-based and trend studies using spectral reflectance. And this kind of technology is getting more and more available. What I'm showing in the plots here is an example of a lab-based imaging spectrometer being used to map grain size for lab samples, or the same one being used outside to map grain size at sort of just the hill slope scale. So it's becoming more available, but we don't yet have a satellite for this yet. Okay, so then let's talk about structure for motion. So structure for motion, we're kind of shifting paths here from just surface information to volume information. And the way that we do that with images more and more commonly is using something called structure from motion. So this is a photogrammetric method that uses many overlapping images to model the 3D structure of an object or area. And a schematic of how this is actually done is over here. So as you view an object from multiple angles, you can match the same point amongst those images, and it allows you to reconstruct the geometry of the scene. And I'm showing an example here of this done at multiple scales. So a smartphone just taking pictures. Each little blue square represents a picture location around an object at the study plot scale from a drone and at the basin scale from an airplane. So it's a very scalable method. A 3D model can be collected at multiple scales. It can be geo-referenced. It can be processed with commercial software that's widely available. And the outcome of structure for motion is a point cloud. So basically all these individual points that were matched between pictures come together to create a surface model of the scene that's then rasterized into a digital surface model. And you can take the difference between a snow-free and snow-on digital surface model to map snow depth. And I just wanted to point out that if you're using a drone, usually you geo-reference it with ground control points that are placed throughout the scene and then GPS. And that's how you sort of place your model in the right spot on Earth. And then here's just an example of a time series of snow depth maps using structure for motion. This is my study plot here in Utah. And one of the things I wanted to point out for structure for motion is just how high resolution these models can be. So this is collected, imagery collected from a drone flown over the study plot. And for different transects across the scene at different flights, the red, yellow, and blue are just transects across the scene for different flights. And then the black is the snow free. So this represents snow depth. You can actually see our ski tracks within the surface elevation model. So we're creating surface elevation models that are centimeter or millimeter scale. It's almost too high of resolution. But because drones are relatively easy to deploy and map out over a study plot, you can collect time series of snow depth at relatively high resolution throughout an entire season relatively easily. Okay, and then here's just another example just to show off how cool structure for motion can be. This one is in Mammoth Lakes, California, at Mammoth Ski Area. And not only can you see ski tracks and even sort of runnel snowmelt patterns, but you can actually see a snow pit that was being dug at the time of overflight. So it allows you to map snow depth at really high resolution, but it only allows you to map snow that you can see because it's using imagery. And so vegetation, which is masked out here, can be an issue for structure for motion. Okay, and then moving on to LiDAR, the sort of last few minutes I have here. So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. It's an altimetry measurement. So it's the height of the surface based on distance from the LiDAR sensor to the surface itself. A laser pulse is emitted, reflected back to the plane, and it tracks the time that it takes for that. And from that, it can reconstruct a point cloud of the surface. And the point cloud is just made up of points that are X, Y, and Z. So latitude, longitude, and elevation of the surface. That's then gridded to a digital elevation model. So what comes out of this is the elevation of everything at the surface at very high resolution. And the trees, when you leave them in, you can leave them in, and that is a digital surface model. So that means it includes everything at the surface. But something you can do with LiDAR data that's pretty cool is you can actually kind of strip out all of those points, and you can get a digital terrain model or a bare earth model that doesn't have vegetation in it. And that's not something you can do with structure for motion photogrammetry yet. And these are just some examples of returns. So there's point density, number of LiDAR returns, and normalized LiDAR return intensity, just to visualize some of this data from LiDAR. And this is all from the Airborne Snow Observatory. So just to visualize it pretty simply here, right? The plane flies over in summer or fall when there's no snow, again, when there is snow, and then we can map snow depth across the whole landscape by just differencing those two retrievals. And just to visualize what this looks like for the Tuolumne River Basin in the Sierra Nevada, the water of which goes to the city of San Francisco, you can map snow depth. This is an extra large scale over here. You can map snow depth at very high resolution, and then actually combine that with modeled density, snow density, and get snow water equivalent from that. So that's what the Airborne Snow Observatory has been doing. Has been sort of a shift in snow hydrology, is sort of this regular airborne mapping of sort of key watersheds to look at where snow is distributed across the landscape, and then turn that information into how much water is actually available and how it changes over time. Another thing that can be done with LiDAR rather than just snow depth is that you can fly before and after a storm, and then actually map how much snow fell during a storm and where that snow fell. So that's another sort of really cool application of LiDAR. That was sort of a whirlwind like overview of optical remote sensing. There's a lot of ground to cover, but I just wanted to introduce some of these concepts and talk about what we can actually get from optical remote sensing. And it's really valuable for both climate and hydrology. So one example that I'm showing over here is just from satellites, how can we detect how snow is changing over time? And this has probably been one of the most valuable records we have of climate. So we know that snow is generally in decline, and we know that from long-term satellite records. We can also get things that are useful for hydrology, like basin snow depletion curves. We can get snow volume, and even downstream, we can get snow water equivalent from LiDAR and photogrammetry. All of this information can be assimilated to improve our models. And it's all just, it's both the long-term records and sort of this newer technology, LiDAR and photogrammetry, is really sort of changing the way that we monitor snow at multiple scales. So I'm just going to end on that wrap up. slide. And we can stay on a little bit longer if you have to go. It's 3 o'clock, totally understand. But if you have questions, I'll stay on for a little bit longer and try to answer those questions. And I'll start with some questions in the chat that came up while I was actually going through. One of them is by surface darkening. Do I mean that it comes from satellite or natural darkening or shadows? So when I say surface darkening, I mean actual deposition, darkening due to deposition of dark aerosols. So when dust or black carbon get deposited on it, that's what I mean by surface darkening, as opposed to shadowing, which would also be surface darkening. But in this context, I mean the actual physical lowering of reflectance due to the deposition of light absorbing particles. And then, the questions are coming quick. Let's see. There's a question, is there any satellite sensor which can be used to study water bodies within glaciers, glacial lakes formed inside a glacier, which is not visible from the top? So that would be using radar, which can penetrate through ice and other land surface types. So to answer that question, I would actually recommend that you come in a month from now to attend the microwave and radar remote sensing lecture, because those wavelengths can actually penetrate through snow rather than just give surface information. Oh, and then this is a great question. So someone brought up that I mentioned that structure for motion from drones is almost too high of resolution. And then what's the potential for this based on satellite data? This is a great question, and I didn't actually spend much time on this, but we can actually, there's photogrammetry being done on satellite data now. It's not necessarily structure for motion. It's another type called stereometry, where it uses 2 or 3 overlapping scenes to do the same thing. It creates surface geometry and maps surface elevations, and that is then used differentially to map snow depth. And the resolution of that is more on the meter scale rather than centimeter scale. I would encourage you to look up work by, say, like David Sheen and some other people to read more about that and uncertainties that are associated with mapping snow depth from satellite imagery. And then another question with remote sensed estimation of grain size, how do you resolve the effects or influence of multiple day frost deposition? That is a great question. So when we map grain size from satellites, we don't necessarily know what the surface looks like. So if there is frost or surface wear at the surface, I don't think we know that a priori. So we would just retrieve probably a pretty small grain size, just because that's a small amount of ice that the light is passing through. And then if the frost is gone by the next retrieval and the grain size is bigger, maybe that would be one of our hypotheses for why the grain size was so small during that retrieval. And then another question, is structure for motion accuracy sensitive to snow albedo? Again, a great question. So snow is quite bright, and what that means is that sometimes you don't have a lot of texture or variation at the surface to actually match points within the algorithm. Essentially, it looks like a big white, sort of blank canvas. But it turns out that cameras these days are better than our eyes at picking out texture and variation at the surface. So very rarely do we have issues reconstructing snow surface elevations from imagery. And I encourage you, if you're interested, to read more about that. There's don't highlight my own work here, but a paper by one of my graduate students, Joe Meyer, published in 2019 that talks about that sort of reconstructing and using structure for motion over very bright snow surfaces. Okay, and then the next question is, what about the probability of avalanche based on snow grain size remote sensing? Yeah, so this is one of those, I think being able to detect avalanches from satellites is one of those really active areas of research. And I haven't seen much done about using grain size, although that's a pretty good idea. And one of the reasons why I haven't seen that is because MODIS is probably too coarse at 500 meters to really detect avalanches, except for the very largest ones. And then Landsat and even Sentinel-2 aren't frequent enough to really capture those. But I have seen work using Sentinel-1, so using radar data to look at avalanche frequency and sort of change detection. So I think that is probably really promising, but using grain size is it's a really interesting idea. And then, okay, another great question is, can you infer snow properties from LiDAR reflectance? Say you knew the black carbon and other impurities and you wanted to estimate snow grain radius. So this is another, you guys are full of great questions. So yeah, so snow reflectance, LiDAR reflectance, right? It's at a very specific wavelength, so 1064 nanometers, which is sensitive to grain size. So the returned intensity that you would get from LiDAR would be related to grain size. So you might get a lower returned intensity with larger grains and a higher returned intensity with smaller grains. But it does require to know a little bit more information at the surface if you want to turn your LiDAR intensity into a reflectance value, which is what you really need to relate it back to grain radius. So it's possible. There are a few initial studies that have attempted to do that. If you're aware of the Western Snow Conference that happens in April, actually one of my students will be presenting information on our sort of initial efforts to try to do that in a really quantitative fashion. So it's a great question. So then the next one, do you know of any methods that are being developed or have been developed to directly measure snow water equivalency using remote sensing? Again, this is another one I get to say you should come to the next remote sensing talk where they're doing radar and microwave. So those wavelengths can actually penetrate through the snow. And you can relate that to density and snow water equivalent using certain wavelengths. So I would encourage you to come to the radar remote sensing talk. And they'll cover those longer wavelengths where the energy is being emitted from the Earth itself or radar being emitted from the satellite. Okay, I think that's the kind of last question that popped up. I'm sorry if I missed any. They were kind of coming in fast and furious, but I really appreciate anyone who stayed on. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to email me. You can find my email on the internets. And I'm happy to answer any more questions or point you to papers or resources if you're interested in this work for your graduate work or beyond. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Join us on the last Friday of next month for the next webinar in this series. And big thank you to McKenzie. All right. Have a good weekend, everyone.